invite you to stand for the reading of our scripture, the book of Ruth. And so Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May God do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. God's word for God's people.
Thanks be to God.
I had a text right before worship from Russell, and he said, "I see that you're speaking or preaching on from the story of Ruth and Naomi tonight." And he said, "If only I'd caught you in time. I just heard a country song, and there was a line that I think you could really use. If you leave me, you will take me with you." And I feel like that would have taken me in an entirely different direction. So I should always consult with Russell. So the book of Ruth could easily have been named the book of Naomi. While we most frequently lift up Ruth's devotion to her mother-in-law and repeat these familiar words that we just heard read from our text, the focus of this story really is primarily upon Naomi and her plight. She finds herself as a refugee in a foreign land, a widow and childless after her husband and sons died. It was both Ruth and Naomi who forged a way in a world that was not set up for them to do so. Naomi and her husband Elimelech had left Bethlehem during a time of famine. This famine occurred during a period when the judges ruled prior to when Israel had demanded to be ruled by a king. And it was a time that was filled with chaos and anarchy, and the shortage of the food in the land only intensified that chaos. So they loaded up their family and set out in search of a place where they could find food. And they ended up in the land of Moab, one of the last places that they would have wanted to live, but out of necessity and in hope of survival, Moab was the place where they settled as refugees and made their new home. Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Their sons, Mahlon and Chilion, had married two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. But after they had been living there for about 10 years, both of Naomi's sons also died, and she found herself living alone in the foreign land of Moab. Her daughters-in-law were her only surviving relatives. And since women in this particular cultural context were valued according to their relationship with the men in their lives, Naomi's situation looked quite unpromising. No husbands, no sons, no other male relatives in Moab, and she was living there in a foreign land. She had little prospect for survival. She eventually heard that God had shown favor upon her homeland of Judah, so she decided to return there in hope of finding a way to survive. Naomi set out toward her homeland with her daughters-in-law following her. Now I imagine this next scene was a little bit of a jolting moment for all three of them. They all thought they were on their way back to Bethlehem with Naomi when she had a sudden change of heart. She turned around and said, "Go back to your mother's homes. Don't follow me. May God grant you security in the homes of your mothers." Naomi blessed them and urged them to go back to their families of origin, noting that she could no longer give them new husbands. She kissed them, they wept, and they told her they wanted to continue on with her, but she urged them to return home and assured them that they would face a better future in their own homeland. Naomi's blessing to these women included a call for God to treat her daughters-in-law as well as they had treated her. She recognized that while she had felt alone and abandoned and dealt with harshly by God, she had felt deeply loved and cared for by these two women. Orpah eventually relented and returned to Moab, but Ruth clung to Naomi. She would not hear of turning away. She wasn't shaken by Naomi's sudden change of heart, urging her to return home, and she assured her mother-in-law of her devotion and commitment with these familiar words that we just heard. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. We've heard Ruth's words to Naomi in weddings, a statement of devotion and love, deep love that involves persistence, a love that is loyal and faithful through all things, a love that includes concrete action on behalf of or in interest of another person with whom one is in relationship. And the Hebrew word for this kind of love, this love that we receive from God, is hesed. Ruth persisted with Naomi even though it meant an uncertain future for herself, stating that her own steadfast devotion, not only in her life but in her death. Phyllis Tribble says, not only has Ruth broken with family, country, and faith, but she has also reversed sexual allegiance. A young woman has committed herself to the life of an old woman rather than search for a husband, and she has made this commitment not until death do us part, but beyond their deaths. One female has chosen another female in a world where life depends upon men. There is no more radical decision in all the memories of Israel. So Ruth stands in a long line of women willing to resist the societal expectations of their culture. From Puah and Shiphrah, the midwives who subverted Pharaoh's orders to kill all of the firstborn sons of the Hebrew women, enabling Moses' life to be spared. To other women like Tamar, Rahab, and Bathsheba, who didn't follow the established rules of the culture but still ended up appearing later on in the very genealogy of Jesus. And all of this happens in spite of Naomi, who was so consumed with her own way of thinking about the world and the situation in which she found herself that she nearly cut off the possibility of her own redemption, which would eventually be made known through Ruth. Naomi had nearly forced Ruth, the one who would lead her toward life, back to Moab. I found myself wondering this week where we find ourselves in this particular story, as Ruth or as Naomi. When I hear this story, I often find myself going down the line of thinking about where and to whom I am making commitments. It's fair to say that there are those times when we do identify with Ruth, stating where our hearts are leading us, where we are planting our feet with the force and certainty of hesed love, the kind of love that will not let go, the kind of love that persists, that holds on with loyalty and steadfastness, even in the face of circumstances that make so little sense, in the face of odds that are less than favorable. But can't we just as easily find ourselves identifying a little more with Naomi, saying that we left our homes full and are returning to them completely empty, when in reality, we left our own Bethlehem in a time of famine and hunger, not fullness. And we return alone, and not alone and empty, but with a companion like Ruth beside us, surrounding us with life-giving hesed. But how often are we unable to see the Ruth beside us because we're so focused on that which we have lost? Our vision so obscured by our own misery and grief, anger, or sadness that we can't even begin to know how to take in the goodness that's in our midst, walking alongside us, patiently, persisting with us. It's in these kinds of moments that all we can do is say, don't even call me by my given name. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because God has dealt so bitterly with me. Just go away and leave me alone. To be fair, there are those times in our lives where we need to be in exactly that place, to allow ourselves to be in those moments, recognizing that the real danger enters when we decide that that's where we're going to live, that that's where we're going to plant our feet, in the misery of our grief, our anger. As some of us have been working through Richard Rohr's book, Breathing Underwater, on the spirituality of the 12 steps during these weeks of Lent, I've been thinking about the ways that we get caught up in the thinking that our way of seeing reality is the only way to see reality. Rohr says, stinking thinking is the universal addiction. Substance addictions like alcohol and drugs are merely the most visible form of addiction. But actually, we are all addicted to our own habitual way of doing things, our own defenses, and most especially our patterned way of thinking or how we process our reality. When we've only known one story, It's hard to imagine how to live our way into new paths. I think about the time in 4th grade when I was determined to try out for the boys' Little League baseball team. My parents signed me up, they drove me to the tryouts, they walked with me halfway to the field, where I promptly froze. I thought I could do it. I had talked about it for months. I had been practicing baseball with my cousins in the yard, but I froze. I was terrified to actually do it. But there my mom and dad were beside me, encouraging me and loving me, not only in that moment, but in the days ahead when I was stuck in that mode of agonizing and being so hard on myself for what I saw as chickening out. They simply stayed beside me and loved me. I also think about the night before I was to leave for college, and I've told some of this story here before, when I sat in my parents' house in tears. No one in my family had ever left Silva. And I had no idea to step into that new reality for which there was no map or structure, leaving behind everything that was familiar and known. Now, mind you, I was not going to Moab. I was just going about an hour away to Mars Hill, but it might as well have been Moab. My mom and dad were there beside me, assuring me that we would figure it out together, even though they didn't have any answers or bring out a secret map to hand me. They helped me see that I was moving towards something bigger, something that I could in fact do, something that they had no idea what it looked like, but they felt like I could do it. They simply stayed beside me and loved me. I also think about the days that followed Abby being so sick as an infant, when David and I were both working full-time, trying to find child care for a 3-month-old on a feeding tube, which is no easy task. And my dad ended up being the one who helped us with child care. And I drove Abby back and forth to Silva after, get up early, come to work, leave work at 5, get over to Silva at about 6 or 6:30 on those days that David and I were both working. We were so tired and weary, sometimes angry and confused, but we kept moving towards something that was bigger than we were. And there they were again, my parents, sitting beside us and loving us. It made me wonder a lot about the part of Naomi's story that we don't know. Why she didn't or couldn't really see Ruth beside her. What had gotten her to that point? Was she hesitant to move to a foreign land, to Moab with her husband and her 2 boys from the beginning? Did she have to go because she had no choice but to follow her husband? Would she have preferred that they had taken their chances during the famine in Bethlehem rather than moving to Moab? How much was her inability to recognize and receive the hesed love of her daughter-in-law limited by how much she just wanted to get home, back to the familiar, to Bethlehem, where she said she had been full when she left and now returned empty, despite being accompanied by Ruth? Could Naomi have been trying to save Ruth and Orpah from her own fate, being found alone in a foreign land, with no family, particularly male family members in this time, to offer security and stability, asking God's blessing to be shown toward them in the same way that they had shown love for her and her sons, who were now dead? We don't know the answers to these questions, but we do know that she was stuck. There's a lot more to this story, but she was stuck in that moment. And this part of the story, Naomi just couldn't get out. And we all get there from time to time, stuck in a moment of the story. The truth is that even though Naomi felt alone and bitter and stuck, she was still seeking God. She went back home because she had heard that God had shown favor upon the people in her homeland. She didn't know for sure if it was true, but she had heard it was true. And she moved toward it because that's all she knew how to do when it felt like everything else in her life had become so uncertain, like shifting sands beneath her feet. She also was not alone. Ruth was right there beside her the whole time, supporting her and loving her. And maybe that's really our best hope. Companions along the way who will be beside us, loving us and supporting us when we are plain stuck. Loving and supporting us when we can't even see them. Loving and supporting us when we don't even want to hear our own names. Still there loving us and supporting us when one day in hindsight, We can hopefully see and acknowledge how they helped us through when we couldn't even recognize that they were lovingly and gently carrying us in their warm embrace the entire time.